they can find their way through the darkness, that they don't need to be as scared of it as they might have once been, and that there are even answers that we can find in the darkness. If we take time to be still, if we take time to appreciate that stillness, then we may find the answers that we're looking for. Recognizing the relationship between sleep, dreams and our mental health, but specifically how grief shows up for us. And this is one of the reasons, as I say, quite controversially in the book, I challenge the 5 stages of grief. Grief is more like a roller coaster than it is a flight of stairs. We do not grieve in stages. There are no stages of grief.
Today's guest is my dear friend, Delphi Ellis, a qualified counsellor, well-being trainer and mindful practitioner supporting people in grief, mainly those bereaved by murder and suicide. Now working in the community promoting mental health maintenance and recovery, mindful leadership and workplace wellness. Delphi is an author, and her latest book, Answers in the Dark: Grief, Sleep and How Dreams Can Help You Heal. Drawing on nearly 2 decades of therapeutic work, research and ancient wisdom proven to helpfully manage the mind, Delphi connects the dots between sleep, dreams and our mental health. She particularly highlights the impacts of grief and loss on our well-being, which can ultimately affect the quality of our nighttime rest, even if no one has died. Her book guides the readers on a journey to make friends with nighttime learning, what the dark might have to offer to achieve a calmer, healthier, happier life. Welcome, Delphi.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
God, I'm so excited for this conversation. So, what is one of the most courageous things that you have done, if you possibly can pick one?
Oh, thank you for asking. I have to say it was writing my book. For me, writing Answers in the Dark was a journey in itself. I actually describe it to people as it was a bit like being in labour, only the labour lasted 10 years. And so it was a long process. And for me, and I make no secret of this, when I was writing Answers in the Dark, I actually, as most counsellors do from time to time, went and had my own personal therapy, because launching this book, or giving birth to this book, if you like, was such a huge thing for me. And it's been a dream of mine, if you'll pardon the pun, it's been a dream of mine all my life. So, but to actually have it out there and open to scrutiny, and, you know, having people read it and make comments and reviews on it and things like that, it was a really big thing for me. And I think one of the reasons it took me so long to write, partly because I wanted to get the science right, and I wanted to make sure that it was the best book possible for the subject that it covers and the different areas that it covers. But also it was because I wanted to make sure that if, you know, as you sometimes do, someone leaves a review that was, just awful, which thankfully hasn't happened yet. But if they did, I wanted to make sure that I was resilient enough for that I was in a good place for that. And so, as I say, like most counsellors do throughout their career, especially with something as big as this, for me personally, because it's been a lifelong ambition, I had my own personal therapy. And so it was, yeah, absolutely. In terms of the bravest things I've ever done, I think writing a book is absolutely, and publishing a book is out there, is up there.
That's absolutely courageous, definitely.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's a thing, because unless you've written a book or unless you've put something out there in terms of your own content, and I include in that even designing your own website, or if you run your own business and you've got particular courses that you run or anything like that, it does take courage. It does take an amount of courage to do that. And actually also in the book, I challenge a lot of myths. So, I was acutely aware, and I actually mentioned this in the beginning of Answers in the Dark. I mentioned that I'm acutely aware that there will be some researchers who do not like the way I've written it because of the way I've approached the science, because of the way I challenge some of the myths, and the way I talk about grief, for example. I know some people won't like that. And so, but that's intentional. It was intentional in the sense that I think we need to have these conversations. I think we need to open up a conversation about, when we talk about the stages of grief in inverted commas, I think we need to have a conversation about, is that the most helpful way to talk about grief these days? I don't think so. And so I talk about that in the book, and I really bust open this thing about the 5 stages of grief and why I think that can actually cause more problems when we look at grief in such a linear fashion. So yeah, so for me, it wasn't just the process of writing and publishing the book, but it was also, I know that the content for some people, certainly in the academic community specifically, they might feel challenged by that. And so that in itself was a brave thing to do.
I mean, absolutely. And to be honest to yourself, it's a good thing if people are going to challenge it, because it's your beliefs. You've done the research, and like you said, you've taken all this time to write it. It wouldn't be a great bestseller if it wasn't challenged.
Yeah, exactly that. And I think that's why it offers something. I think the book offers something in terms of helping people navigate these really difficult times, but without the usual stuff that they so when I talk about sleep, for example, I kind of joke in the book that, a lot of people will pick up a magazine and the magazine will say, stop drinking coffee, for example. And yes, absolutely, caffeine plays a part in how well we sleep. But I argue in the book that it's way more than that, and I think we need to be having those conversations. So yeah, you're right. It's something, if it brings something to the conversation, then that's a good thing. If it gets people talking, if it starts a dialogue, then that's absolutely met its purpose. That's what it's designed to do.
Absolutely. So what took you on your journey of therapeutic work? Is this something you naturally fell into, or is this from your experiences?
I think it's a combination of the two. I think from a very early age, I mean, in terms of my work around dreams specifically and exploring people's dreams, I mean, I grew up in a household where we would talk about our dreams over the breakfast table. I lived in a very, I would say it was unusual in terms of the outside world, but to me, this was normal. That I would, I mentioned in Answers in the Dark that my mum used to use an ancient divination tool called the I Ching, which is a series of coins that you kind of shuffle and then they'll give you wisdom about your life and the future. And I can still hear the clink of those coins that she used to use at night. And that was normal for me. This was how my mum kind of brought us up. We were in this environment where we were openly having conversations about things like dreams and all types of interesting phenomena, things like predicting the future and stuff like that. So this was normal for me. It was only when I went to school, and I remember going into the playground one day and saying to someone in the playground, I had this most amazing dream last night. Let me tell you about it. And then sort of looking at me as if to say, what are you talking about? As if that was a weird thing to do. So I think from that perspective, when I then, in my late sort of 20s, I made a decision that I wanted a change of career. And so that's when I started the process of training in therapeutic work. And that, as you probably know yourself, it takes years to do that. It's not something that happens overnight. So I think really from an early age, I'd always had an interest in helping people, and the therapeutic world seemed to be a natural way to do that. But then as time went on, it just so happened that the work I did really I didn't design it this way, but the majority of the work that I did was with people that had been bereaved. And so it then kind of, that became part of the pathway, was that I then worked with people that had been bereaved. And that, for me, I do think that was influenced by the death of my father. My father died when I was a teenager. And I do think that that had a profound impact on me and my view of the world, and why things happen. And so I think that directly influenced the work that I did in terms of wanting to help people. But it just so happened that the work that I did was around bereavement. So yeah, I think it's a combination. I think it's a combination of having an interest in that particular field, but also influenced by my lifetime experiences.
Yes, and I'm sorry to hear that about your dad.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where it happened a long time ago, but as I talk about in the book, grief doesn't have an expiry date. So, you know, he's as much a part of my life today as he was before he died, but just in a very different way.
How much of a bigger problem is insomnia? Because you hear a lot about that these days.
Yeah, so when I was doing the research for Answers in the Dark, there was some conversations at the time that insomnia had become a global problem. So the World Health Organization at the time identified that insomnia, and I characterized that in the book as trouble falling asleep or staying asleep, that is essentially a global problem. So something like 20% of the world's population will have problems sleeping. And in the UK, we are a nation of poor sleepers. So the part in the book is referred to as a sleepless society. And so in terms of in the UK specifically, we are a nation of poor sleepers. And there's lots of different reasons for that. One of the things I talk about in the book is that, yes, absolutely, like I said earlier, what we do during the day will influence how well we sleep at night. So if I'm checking my emails 10 minutes before bed, that's probably going to affect how well I sleep. But at the same time, one of the things I argue in the book is that often it's not just what we're doing during the day that stops us sleeping, but what's happened to us or is happening to us. So it might be that I have experiences which I haven't processed. And if I'm just dancing around them during the day by keeping busy, the minute I get into bed, they're going to show up for me. And they will either show up as me not being able to sleep, or they'll show up in the dreams that I'm having. So I argue in the book that for me, and certainly in the work I've been doing over the last 20 years, grief shows up for us in ways that I think as a society we don't generally recognize. So when we talk about grief, we assume that we're talking about the death of a loved one. But as I say in the book, if COVID taught us anything, it's that grief doesn't just belong to death. You know, grief belongs to anything that mattered to us that's no longer there. So I include in that a relationship breakdown, redundancy. Even children leaving home to go to university can be a source of grief. So I think that's one of the things I'm sort of careful to explain in the book, is that it's not just the daily habits that we do that we know probably don't help so much, like too much coffee. It's also the other things that are influencing us in different ways.
Yeah, I mean, God, that's really interesting, because especially like you say, most people will associate grief with someone passing, but there are so many different ways. And even, yes, empty nest syndrome, children going off to university, a lot of my friends are going through that at the moment. Totally agree. Yes.
Yeah.
So in the controversy, if that's the right way to put it in your book, what are the three big myths of sleep?
So in the book, if I kind of explain, the book is split into three parts. So the first part of the book is why I think we can't sleep. And that covers all the different things I've mentioned, like grief. And I have a chapter in the book called The 4 a.m. Mystery, which is why we're awake in the middle of the night and things like that. But I also talk about these three big myths of sleep. And this is really on the back of all the work I've done over the last 20 years. When I've been talking with people, I've found that there are things that people, and all of us to some extent, have bought into that are actually, and ironically, stopping us sleeping. So one of the big myths of sleep is that we all need 8 hours sleep. That is one of the biggest myths of sleep. And yet ironically it's one of the things that stops us sleeping. So I mentioned some research in the book which identified that 79% of people lay awake at night worrying. When they're awake at night, they're laying awake worrying. And the research suggested that the reason they're laying awake at night worrying is because they're worrying that they're not going to get their 8 hours sleep. So ironically, this thing about I must get my 8 hours has become part of the problem. So, and I'll tell you how this shows up. So say, for example, I have to be up at 6 o'clock in the morning because I've got to be somewhere, I've got to catch a train, or I've got to leave the house. So what I do, and I'm talking generically, what we do is I think, right, I've got to be up at 6 o'clock in the morning. I will work back 8 hours to see when I need to go to bed. So what we then do is we set our bedtime for 10 o'clock because that way we'll get our 8 hours in. But what if I'm not sleepy at 10? What if I go to bed at 10 o'clock and actually I'm not ready for sleep? What tends to happen is we then lay in bed thinking, I'm not going to get my 8 hours. I'm going to be so tired in the morning. I'm not going to be able to concentrate. And so ironically, the very thing that we've done because we think we should has now become part of the problem. And one of the worst things we can do when we're laying awake at night, one of the worst things we can do is that conversation about, I'm going to be so tired in the morning. What's wrong with me? Why can't I sleep? I need to get my 8 hours. That activates that part of our brain, which now thinks there's a problem. So that fight or flight response kicks in because we start to get stressed. And so there is no way your brain is going to authorize sleep when you're stressed. And so you don't sleep. And so ironically, this 8 hour myth has become part of the problem. And so what I say to people is focus on quality rather than quantity. You know, think about the fact that you might need 6 hours sleep. You might need 10 hours sleep. When you're a teenager, you need more sleep. I say this to challenge people because there's an assumption that teenagers are being lazy. They're really not. They really do need more sleep. And so, so teenagers need more sleep, just as you would need more sleep if you've got the flu, if you've had COVID, you'll know that sleep is the best medicine. So there will be periods of your life when you might need less sleep. There will be periods of your life when you might need more sleep. And it really is about getting to know you and your cycles and yourself well enough to know when you feel sleepy. But that then leads on to another myth that I talk about, is that this idea that feeds into the first myth is that that bedtime is a specific time. So when I say to people, when do you go to bed? The majority of people will reply to me, oh, I go to bed at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock. But actually the answer I'm looking for is when I'm sleepy. That is when we should be going to bed. But if we don't go to bed when we're sleepy, we will push through it. And so then what tends to happen is we then are laying in bed because we've pushed through that feeling of sleepiness. When we then try and go to bed when it's convenient to us, because we think, right, now I was tired at 9, but I don't want to go to bed then. Game of Thrones might have been on, so I want to watch that. And then, of course, what happens at 10 o'clock, I then think, right, it's convenient to me now to go to sleep. But of course, I'm then laying in bed staring at the ceiling because you've pushed through that sleepiness. So now you have to you have to wait for that sleep pressure, it's called. You have to wait for that sleep pressure to build, and it will come back. You just have to wait for it. So that was another myth, is the idea that, you know, bedtime is a specific time. It's more to do with you tuning into your body and knowing, you know, how your body responds. And of course, your body is also responding to light and dark. You might find it harder to get to bed during the summer. You know, if it's bright outside, you might find that you need more sleep in the winter when it's dark, because of the way we're governed by the seasons and the cycles. So that was the second one. And then the third myth was about the idea that it's unnatural to wake up at night. Again, I think we've bought into this myth that we need this 8 hours solid block of sleep. I think it's great because what we've tried to do in the 21st century is, if you've noticed, we've tried to split our day of 24 hours into 3 really convenient blocks of 8. So we have 8 hours for work, 8 hours for sleep, and 8 hours for play. But of course, we don't work like that. As humans, we can't compartmentalize ourselves like that. So yeah, the idea that we should sleep for 8 solid hours in itself is a myth. And so it's quite natural to wake up at night. But again, what tends to happen is we wake up in the middle of the night and we think, what's wrong with me? I'm supposed to get 8 hours sleep. What's wrong with me? Why have I woken up? What's going on? Why can't I get a good night's sleep? And of course, then you've activated that stress response again, and there's no way your brain will authorize sleep. So it's not that you wake up in the night that's the problem. It's what you do next. And I talk about all of this in Answers in the Dark. I talk about how we can kind of learn to manage the mind. And I expand on those myths in more detail about how it shows up for us. But yeah, it's basically about recognizing how we've bought into these myths, and how ironically these myths, for me, these myths are what's stopping us sleeping.
Yeah, definitely. So what is the concept of your book?
So the concept of the book really is about recognizing the relationship between sleep, dreams and our mental health, but specifically how grief shows up for us. So like I was saying, the first part of the book is all about why I think we can't sleep. And this is on the back of the research that I've done and the people that I've spoken with. And again, some of those reasons might surprise people. It's not necessarily what you think it is. One of the things I then go on to talk about in the second part of the book is I've offered what I call the sleep cycle repair kit. And that looks at lots of different things that might be stopping us sleeping and how we might be able to manage that helpfully going forward. Now, ironically, again, the things that we think might be stopping us sleeping can stop us sleeping. So if, for example, I'm looking at my email before bedtime, then yes, to some extent, that might be playing a part in why I can't sleep. In the same way as if I look at my phone in the middle of the night, if I wake up in the night, our instinct is to reach for the phone. Why? Because we want to know what time it is. Why? Because we want to know, am I going to get my 8 hours, right? This is the traps we've fallen into. So this is why one of the things I mention is that, yes, if you look at your mobile phone in the middle of the night, you are flashing your brain with light. So your brain then might start to think, well, it's daytime. And there's no way your brain will authorize sleep if it thinks it's daytime because you've just looked at your phone. So that's one thing. And we know to some extent that technology plays its part. Also argue in the book that there are other things that stop us sleeping. And a lot of it is the way we talk to ourselves and the way we talk to ourselves, particularly at night. And that's one of the reasons why there's a chapter in the book called The 4 a.m. Mystery, because it's often at that time of night when things feel really heavy, really dark. I refer to it in the book as going down the plug hole. And because it's dark down there, and it's hard to get back up. Yeah, when it's dark down there. So, and also one of the things that I challenge in the book is our fear of darkness. I think we have fallen into the trap of humans as being afraid of the dark. And again, that's not necessarily something evolutionary. It might be, but it might also be because your parents said, don't let the bed bugs bite. There's things that have happened, people say to us over our lifetimes where they kind of go in, and they kind of get embedded. So I challenge that. I challenge how we need to make friends with the dark. And then the third part of the book is all about dreams. Now, the book itself is kind of weaved with dreams. I talk about dreams all the way through the book. And I have sections in the book where I talk about the different types of dreams that we have. But one of the things I'm really clear to mention is that it's not a dream dictionary. So it's not to kind of tell you what your dreams mean. It's more saying, here are some tips that will help you interpret your own dreams. So that's really where the book is about. And it is about connecting the dots.
So what actually are dreams?
This is such a great question. I get asked this every time I'm on TV and radio. I get asked, what are dreams? And for me, I kind of put them into kind of two descriptions. One, they are like a friend. So you've probably got friends who can see things that you can't, right? Because we're choosing not to, or because we're so busy. But like when a relationship ends and a friend turns around to you and says, oh, I never liked them anyway. Your dreams are like that. So your dreams can see things that you perhaps are resting underneath your awareness, but at the time, you're not necessarily processing it, or you're not confronting it, or you're not looking at it. So from that respect, I call them friends, but I'm sure as we all do, we may have friends that we listen to every word they say, so we take them seriously, but we may also have friends that we take what they say with a pinch of salt. So you can choose to listen to your dreams or not. You know, that's entirely up to you. But the other way I describe them is they're like an encrypted code. And the reason they're encrypted is so that only you can analyze them. So when people say to me, the media often refers to me as a dream expert. And one of the things I'm always clear to say is when they talk about me as an expert, that's more because I have spent a lifetime studying this field, but it does not make the expert of your dreams. I firmly believe that the best person to decide what their dream means is the dreamer. And so the book really offers a way to help you decrypt them, to decode them. And so looking at them from that perspective. So, yeah, so on the one hand, they're like a friend, but on the other hand, they're an encrypted code that is for you to explore if you want to, when you're ready, and get some insight.
So why do they matter so much? Because we often want to know what they meant and, I didn't remember my dreams. I wish I had. And it was time to wake up at that precise moment when the dream was getting interesting.
Yeah. It's so funny you say that. I have lost count of the number of times I have been contacted by people all over the world who have said, in my dream, this is true story, in my dream, I'm just about to open a box that the lottery numbers are in. But just as I go to open the box, I wake up. And so I never get to know what the lottery numbers are. Can you teach me how to stay asleep so that I can see what the lottery numbers are? And I just say that's not in my remit. That is not in my remit. And actually, maybe you're waking up. Maybe you're waking up when you're meant to wake up. Maybe you're not meant to have the lottery numbers right now. But I've lost count a number of times that's happened where people have said, it's just getting interesting, and then I wake up. I mean, there's other things that wake us up, of course, even just our environment, the central heating clicking on could be enough to wake you up, because when you're dreaming, you're in a very light stage of sleep. But the reason dreams matter for me is because they are an untapped resource. I think we've really kind of, especially in the 21st century, we've really kind of almost put dreams to one side as if they're not necessarily too important, but actually they're like a really valuable resource that you can use to influence and understand what's going on for you. And I'm saying this particularly in the West. I think in the West, we've fallen into this trap of westernizing dreams to the point now where whenever we talk about dreams, people always bring up names like Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. And don't get me wrong, those people they did what they did. They were important influences in their field in the day, and they got the conversation going. So that's important. However, we've also got to remember that in Eastern traditions, and certainly in some part of the world, if I think about Aboriginal culture, for example, we've been looking at dreams for thousands of years. We've been using them as a way to influence our culture, our health, our wealth. And so I think this is one of the things, if we kind of take it back a step and say, actually, we've been dreaming for a very long time. And it's only really in recent years we've perhaps kind of put them into the box of, it's just the subconscious rattling of your mind. If that was the case, I'll give you an example of how dreams have been used. The story of the Twilight Saga, so the story of Bella and Edward, the vampires, the werewolves, by Stephanie Meyer. Stephanie Meyer dreamt that. She dreamt that story from start to finish. When she woke up, she did not sit there and think, what's the symbolic reference of a wolf? What's the symbolic reference of a vampire? She didn't go and sort of grab a dream dictionary and think, I'm going to analyse my dream at this point. She sat down at a typewriter and she wrote the books, the Twilight Saga. And so that's one of the reasons, I sort of say to people, it's not just the subconscious rattling of your mind. There's so much going on. That's why, for me, they matter, because you'll be surprised at the amount of insight they can give you.
I think that is so true, though. There's so much people that actually think, it's okay, but actually, if you can try and decode them. But that's one of my questions for later on.
Okay.
Are nightmares different, and if so, how are nightmares and dreams? We always think, we want to know our dreams, but we see nightmares as, oh no, that was awful, it was scary.
So nightmares are effectively bad dreams. That's what nightmares are. They're still happening in the same period of sleep that we experience dreaming, which is rapid eye movement sleep, for the most part. Some researchers are starting to suggest we dream at other times as well. But certainly from in this perspective, nightmares tend to happen in that period of sleep when we're dreaming. So they are effectively bad dreams. But what's so interesting about nightmares, of course, is that what I find scary, you might not. So let's say, for example, if I was terrified of dogs and I had a dream about a dog, then for me, that would be a nightmare. But if you love dogs, then for you, that might be a lovely dream. So again, it's always going to be context dependent. You know, it's always going to be very much down to the individual about what feels like a nightmare for them. But there are different reasons why we have nightmares as well. I talk about this in Answers in the Dark, that nightmares can be prompted by any number of things. Your room being too hot might be a source of a nightmare. Being stressed might be the source of a nightmare. Ironically, sleep deprivation can be a source of a nightmare. And that's where it becomes the vicious circle. If you're sleep deprived and you have nightmares, of course, what are you going to become from having nightmares? You're going to become sleep deprived. So, and that's another reason why it's so important that we look at what's happening for us during the day and managing that during the day, because whatever we're not dealing with during the day is going to show up for us at night, either because we can't sleep or because of the dreams or nightmares that we're having. And that's why dreams very much for me, I talk about this in different sections of the book, but there certainly are some types of dreams we have which are a form of nighttime therapy. And to some extent, even nightmares can be that, you know, they can be a form of nighttime therapy. They're helping us work through things at night that we're perhaps not dealing with during the day. So yeah, they're definitely something to have a think about.
Definitely interesting concept there for sure. What are some of the interesting phenomena around dreams?
So one of the things I talk about in Answers in the Dark is different types of dreams that people experience. So one of the most common is what's known, and certainly after a bereavement, one of the most common types of dream that people have is called visitation dreams. And this is where their deceased loved one appears to them in a dream. And one of the things I explain in Answers in the Dark is that I put those dreams into two categories. And I found this particularly, but having worked with people bereaved by murder and suicide, I found this particularly with visitation dreams, is that there's kind of two types of visitation dreams that you have. So on the one hand, where a person has had their loved one comes to them in the dream, they will feel as if something really special is happening. And it may well be that in the dream, their loved one appears to them looking very well. They'll often have like a glow about them. They may pass on a message of some kind, which is usually along the lines of, I'm all right where I am, I'm okay, everything's fine, carry on. And when the dreamer wakes up, they will feel as if something really special has just happened. So they get a real sense of this matters, you know, this was a lovely visitation experience. The other type of visitation dream is where the loved one appears to them in the dream, but is acting out of character or is being particularly cruel and unkind. Now, that is not a visitation dream. That's not what I call an authentic visitation dream. That's usually because there's some unfinished business, there's something unresolved, there may be some what ifs and if onlys that are going on for the dreamer at the time. And so that's showing up for them in their dream. And I'm thinking particularly for those bereaved by suicide. I've been contacted by people all over the world with this, where they've been bereaved by suicide and then their loved one appears to them in the dream and says, you know, things that really kind of wrench them and you know, saying things like, you should have known, you should have seen I wasn't okay, you should have done more. That is not a visitation dream. That is the nighttime therapy. That is, you know, when we were talking about nightmares, that's the nighttime therapy. That's where it's the unresolved or unfinished business of our thoughts during the day showing up in our dreams at night. If it's an authentic visitation dream, then the dreamer will wake up feeling better. They certainly won't feel worse for their experience. They'll wake up feeling as if something really magical has just happened. And often in the dream, they will have been given a message along the lines of, I'm okay where I am, everything's great here. They will certainly look well. They'll be perhaps dressed in something, 20 years ago. They'll look how they looked 20 years ago. And that for me is the authentic visitation dream. So yeah, I talk about those types of experiences as well. So it's not just the anxiety dreams that we have, or dreams when someone dies in the context of death dreams, but I also talk about these phenomena that people experience, like visitation, predictive dreams. I talk about those as well, alongside lucid dreaming as well.
It's all so fascinating. Being able to understand this knowledge, what benefits have you seen in your life? It must be phenomenal.
I mean, for me, one of the things about writing the book and having it published, for me, it's allowed me to have these kinds of conversations. It's allowed me to kind of, because for me, one of the things about Answers in the Dark is ultimately a book of hope. It's ultimately about giving people hope that they can find their way through the darkness, that they don't need to be as scared of it as they might have once been, and that there are even answers that we can find in the darkness. If we take time to be still, if we take time to appreciate that stillness, then we may find the answers that we're looking for. And so for me, one of the benefits has been having conversations like this with you, Anita, where, I'm able to kind of start this conversation and give people food for thought. If people read my book and think, I don't agree with a word of that, that's fine. It was only ever designed to kind of start the conversation. Whereas, people have said to me that one of the things they've loved about the book, for example, is the way I've challenged some of these myths, or the way I've talked about certain nighttime phenomena, which historically they found really scary, but now they're starting to see as, okay, maybe I can do something with this. Maybe I can work with this in some way. And so I think for me, that's been one of the biggest benefits of this work is being able to start this conversation.
Because like most people want to know and understand their dreams and decode them. How can one do this? Is there any particular way? I mean, I know there's things like they will say, leave a piece of paper and pen near your bedside when you wake up, write them down. There's a lot of things out there you can do and find out. So what would you say?
Yeah, absolutely that. I mean, the first step really to interpreting your own dreams is recording them. I've been keeping a dream diary for 20 years or more. And one of the fascinating things about that is that there have been times where I've written a dream down, say 10 years ago. And periodically what I do is I go back to my dream diary and I'll have a look at, what I've dreamt about, say 10 years ago. And at the time, I might have had no idea why I had that dream, even doing the work that I do. I may well have thought, well, it might have been about this or it might have been about that. But now I can look back and say, I know exactly what that was about, and so that's another way that dream diaries can be helpful. But the other way dream diaries can be so helpful is that you will start to see patterns in your dreaming. You will start to see why you have certain dreams when you do. So when we're thinking about how do we interpret and explore our own dreams, well, if you start to see, for example, that you have a particular dream every time you see a certain person, or every time you've done a presentation, or every time you've got a deadline coming up, you'll start to see patterns in your dreaming. And that in itself will give you the insight to start to explore it and understand it. So for me, definitely it's about recording them and taking the time. And I give tips on all of that in Answers in the Dark about how to interpret your own dreams. But it starts with keeping a dream diary.
I think you might have answered this, but I'll ask the question anyway. Tell me about the message intentions behind the book and who's it for?
Yeah, so for me, the intention behind the book is, as I say, ultimately a book of hope, but it's also to normalise. I would say fundamentally, one of the things I try to do in the book is to normalise the experiences that we have when we lose someone we love, whether it's the emotions that we feel, whether it's the dreams that we have. To some extent, I aim to normalise that, because I think one of the things that we may have fallen into the trap of doing is medicalising distress. So when, say, for example, a person is still grieving 3 months down the line, they'll be met with phrases like, you should be over it by now. Because we've medicalized distress. We've kind of got into this idea of thinking this is how long you should feel sad for. And yet, of course, and this is one of the reasons, as I say, quite controversially in the book, I challenge the 5 stages of grief. Grief is more like a roller coaster than it is a flight of stairs. We do not grieve in stages. There are no stages of grief. And actually, the person who is attributed with that, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, her son, I talk about her son in the book, and her son said she just wanted to start a conversation. She never intended for her book on death and dying to be interpreted the way that it was. And actually, if you look in the book itself, there are actually more than 5 stages that she refers to. One of the stages in the book that she talks about is hope. But you don't hear that. You don't hear that when we talk about the 5 stages. You never hear hope mentioned. And so this is one of the reasons why I quite controversially, and again, I know it might upset some people, but I challenge that, because I think one of the things it's caused us to do, a bit like the 8-hour myth, it's caused us to think that we're getting grief wrong. You know, if I'm still feeling sad 10 months down the line, then because I should be in this stage of acceptance by now, or this stage of bargaining by now, or whatever one of the stages are that you might connect with, because we think we should be somewhere else in our grief by now, we think we're getting grief wrong. And actually, one of the things that I try to do is normalize that and say, actually, grief doesn't have an expiry date. It's a process. It is not a to-do list. It's not something you wake up in the morning and think, right, well, that's grief done. You know, it just doesn't work like that. But the other thing, in terms of who it will benefit, I mean, it's really aimed at people that have tried everything. So, you know, if you're someone who has tried everything to get a better night's sleep and still can't sleep, then it's as much for them as it is for anyone who's interested in dreams or the subject of grief or anything like that. Because I meet that all the time. You know, I meet people all the time who'll say, I've tried everything, you know, from their lavender pillow spray, nice warm baths before bedtime, and they still can't sleep. And so it really, again, it's really about normalizing that and helping us to look at other things that might be getting in the way. And that includes the way grief shows up.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting. I love all the points you're making, to be honest. So what has been the best thing about writing the book and getting it published out there? Like you said, it's a lot of work gone into it and many years and planning. So finally get it out there.
I think for me, it's been meeting people and having this conversation, starting this conversation with others, or even getting people to maybe think differently about some of the things that we've perhaps, I keep using the phrase falling into the trap of, but I think we have, you know, especially around sleep. It's every time I buy a magazine that's got like a sleep special in it, it usually says something along the lines of, oh, you need to cut out caffeine, you need to stop using your phone and stuff like that. And yeah, absolutely agree with that. But I think it's again, it's starting that conversation about, but what if it's something else? You know, what if there is something else that stops us sleeping at night? And let's have a conversation about that. So for me, it's been those opportunities, like, you know, chatting to you and having the opportunity to talk about it, as well as meeting other writers. I have to say the writing community is just so brilliant because we all understand what it's like. And I think for me, that's been a bonus as well, is meeting all these lovely writers who are kind of trying to make their way as well.
Oh, brilliant. So I know you've been on Loose Women and spoke about dreams. Tell me more about that.
I've been really fortunate to appear on TV and radio over the course of time because it is a subject that fascinates people. So my first ever, I've been on Loose Women a couple of times, but my first ever experience, I was in the studio. So it was in the days before COVID. And I was really fortunate to sit with the Loose Women and have a conversation about what dreams are and how they might be useful to us. What I really loved, and of course what you won't see, if you go onto YouTube, you'll see the Loose Women, the segment. But what you don't see is when the cameras go off, when the segment finishes, is I was allowed to stay in the studio and talk to all the audience about the dreams that they were having. So it was really nice. They were, and the Loose Women stayed as well. So there was Gloria Hunniford, Nadia Sawala was there as well. So there were a few people, Uncle Nolan and people like that. So and they all stayed behind as well to chat with me. So it was really nice. You don't see that because of course the segment finished, but afterwards I got to stay and chat to everyone. So that was really nice.
Usually at this stage, I always ask my guests, what resources do you recommend, 2 daily tips to anyone that wants to access better sleep or overcome insomnia about their dreams? I think we've covered most of it, to be honest. I think my question's a bit redundant there. So in that case, I'm going to ask you, is there anything else you'd like to add?
For me, I'm always grateful for these opportunities. So thank you for opening this space for me to talk about the book. I think for me, as I said earlier, for me, Answers in the Dark is a book of hope. It's about giving people the idea that maybe they're not weird, maybe they're not unusual, maybe actually this is what they're going through is as normal as normal can be. And so really it's just kind of giving them insight into that, and hopefully they'll find the answers in the dark.
Brilliant. So where can the listeners find you online, your book? What's your website, please, Delphi?
So if they're looking for the book, if they go onto the book's own website, which is answersinthedark.com, they'll see on there's some different insights into the book itself. There's a media page where people can watch podcasts like this one, so they can see for themselves what the book might be about. And also they can look at all their different buying options. So they can see it's available on Amazon as well as Hive and other places. But they can also find me at delphiellis.com. So I have my own website where I talk about the work that I'm doing and what I'm involved with.
So there's the book, Answers in the Dark. Do go ahead and buy it. It's an absolute fantastic read, and I'm awaiting my copy, and I can't wait to get stuck in. And I shall be recommending it to everyone. Thank you, Delphi.
Oh, thank you, Anita. It's a pleasure.
I'll leave all the links in the show notes so people can directly access them from there. So that'll be brilliant. So thank you for sharing your deep, insightful wisdom and knowledge with us today. And by doing so, you've definitely given us all something to think about.
Thank you.
Delphi Ellis.
Thank you so much.
So my final question to you is, as we are Create the Courage to be Fearless podcast, what is your definition of courage?
My definition of courage is very similar to Brené Brown's in the sense that for me, courage is about giving yourself permission to be vulnerable. I think sometimes we associate courage with just this keeping calm and carry on, or just keep going no matter what. And actually, sometimes we need to give ourselves permission to stop and to be still. And so for me, courage is around that vulnerability, actually giving ourselves permission to stop and to reset and recharge when we need to.